The billionaire, the divorce papers, and the baby. The billionaire walked into the courthouse with the divorce papers until his wife arrived holding their baby. And what happened next? The air in the Manhattan Supreme Court, deep in the bustling heart of New York City, was heavy with the late September humidity and the silence pregnant with broken stories. For Robert Miller, the magnate behind the city's most imposing skyscrapers, the environment was just another unpleasant formality, an obstacle to be overcome with the same cold efficiency he used to greenlight multi-million-dollar projects. He strode across the main lobby, his polished Italian leather shoes echoing sharply on the worn marble, a sound that cut through the constant murmur of hurried lawyers and anxious families. Each step was a countdown to the end of a chapter he himself had worked hard to close. In his leather briefcase were not blueprints for a new venture, but divorce papers, the legal finality to his marriage with Eliza Hayes, a marriage that began with the promise of a shared future and ended in a deafening silence, filled only by the ping of business emails and notifications. Robert checked his watch, a Patek Philippe worth more than most people's cars in the room. 2:48 p.m., 12 minutes early. Punctuality was a religion to him, a pillar of control in a chaotic world. But here, in this dimly lit, labyrinthine hallway, control felt like an illusion. This wasn't a corporate merger. It was the dissolution of a life. He vaguely remembered a conversation with his lawyer, Mr. Alan Carter, a pragmatic and expensive man who had mentioned the need for extra documentation because of the child. Robert had simply nodded, his jaw clenched. The child. That was how he referred to Timmy in his own mind, as a line item on a to-do list, a logistical complication. He knew his son existed, of course. Every notification from New York Presbyterian, every pediatrician's bill, every email from Eliza with updates was duly received, read by his assistant, and filed in a digital folder named Eliza Personal, a folder he never opened. Room 304, Family Court, had a dark wooden door that creaked when pushed open. The interior was disappointingly mundane. The cold light of fluorescent lamps washed the space in a pale glow, revealing the threadbare carpet and dark wood furniture that had witnessed far too many dramas. His lawyer was already at the table, organizing a stack of documents with a surgeon's precision. "Mr. Miller," Alan Carter greeted him, his voice neutral. "Good. Let's just get this over with," Robert replied, his voice sharper than he intended. He sat down, the only sign of his inner turmoil, the impatient drumming of his fingers on the polished table surface. The judge, a man in his early 60s with graying hair and an expression of professional boredom, cleared his throat. "Case number 789-2025, Miller versus Hayes. Action for dissolution of marriage." It was then that the courtroom door opened again. A slow, deliberate creak that for some reason made the hair on the back of Robert's neck stand up. He didn't turn around. In high-stakes negotiations, he had learned to ignore distractions, to maintain absolute focus on the objective. But the silence that followed that creak was different. It was a dense silence, laden with meaning. And then, the footsteps. Soft, almost hesitant. The same steps Eliza used to take in the early mornings, trying not to wake him when he finally came home after a conference call with investors in Dubai. "Excuse me, Your Honor," her voice rang out, and it was as if an electric current shot down Robert's spine. "I apologize for the delay." He turned, and the world stopped. Eliza stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the hallway light. But she wasn't alone. Cradled in her arms, bundled in a light blue blanket that highlighted the honey color of her eyes, was a baby. A 5-month-old boy, with a tuft of dark, unruly hair, and eyes that were an unmistakable copy of his own. the same steel gray that intimidated boardrooms and annihilated competitors. The baby, Timmy, was awake. His small hand was clenched in a tiny fist, his curious eyes sweeping the strange environment, completely oblivious to the fact that his mere presence had just demolished his father's emotional fortress. Robert's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't surprise. He'd known about Timmy since the positive pregnancy test result appeared in his email, forwarded by Eliza with a single phrase: "We need to talk." The shock was in seeing him for the first time. It was like looking into a mirror that didn't just reflect his features, but every choice, every omission, every act of indifference that had led him to this exact moment. Eliza's eyes met his across the room. There was no anger in them, which somehow made everything infinitely worse. There was only a calm resignation, the acceptance of someone who had already expected everything and now expected nothing more. The judge looked up from the papers, his expression shifting from annoyance to cautious attention. "Ms. Hayes, I was not informed of the presence of a minor at today's hearing." "Neither was I, Your Honor," Eliza replied, her voice steady as she shifted Timmy to her other arm, with the fluidity of someone who had learned to do everything one-handed. "But the nanny had an emergency and I couldn't postpone this hearing again." The words hit him like a punch. How many times had he postponed? How many times had he made her rearrange her life around his schedule, only for his efficient and impersonal assistant, Vanessa, to call at the last minute with an excuse about an unmissable meeting? Robert Miller built an empire by being the strongest man in any room. But there, in that cold, impersonal courtroom, watching the woman he once loved hold the son he never bothered to meet, he realized that all his power, all his fortune, meant absolutely nothing. The two most important people in his life were only a few feet away, and to them, he was just a stranger. A stranger with the same last name and the same eyes. The silence in the courtroom stretched like a steel wire, taut and about to snap. The judge, Judge Matthews, took off his reading glasses and placed them on the pile of files. He observed the scene, the impeccably dressed but visibly shaken billionaire, the woman of quiet dignity cradling a baby who was the miniature image of the man, and the abyss of pain and time that separated them. It was a family drama, like so many others he had presided over. But there was something here, an undertow of tragedy and opportunity that made him hesitate. "Given the circumstances," he finally said, his voice resonating in the silence, "and the presence of the minor, which fundamentally alters the nature of this discussion, I declare a 20-minute recess. I suggest that the parties use this time to talk. Perhaps they will find common ground that was not included in the court documents." Mr. Carter, Robert's lawyer, immediately leaned forward, whispering about alimony, custody, and the complication the child's presence brought to the division of assets. But his words were a white noise, a distant hum. Robert's focus was entirely on Eliza, who, without even looking at him, was already heading for the door. He rose in an impulse, the chair scraping harshly on the floor, profaning the quietness of the place. "Eliza," she stopped, but didn't turn around. Timmy, sensing the tension in his mother's body, began to whimper. A low, plaintive sound that tugged at something inside Robert's chest, a primitive instinct he didn't know he possessed. "We need to talk," he said, his voice hoarse, failing in the attempt to sound authoritative. Eliza finally turned, the movement slow, deliberate. She adjusted Timmy on her shoulder, a gesture so natural it spoke of sleepless nights and deep loneliness. A bitter, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Now you want to talk, Robert? That's interesting timing." The courthouse hallway, with its beige walls and the smell of dust and disinfectant, became the stage for a battle that would not be fought with raised voices, but with the crushing weight of what had gone unsaid for months. Other people walked past them, immersed in their own dramas. But to Robert, it was as if they were alone in a vacuum. Timmy had calmed down, his small head resting on Eliza's shoulder, his tiny fingers curled into the knit of her sweater. Robert found himself unable to look away. He studied every detail, the perfect curve of the ear, the way the dark hair formed a swirl on top of his head, the seriousness of the expression that made him look like a miniature executive. "He has your stubborn chin," Eliza said, her voice devoid of emotion, noticing Robert's scrutiny. "And your eyes. When he gets angry, he looks like a mini dictator about to fire someone." I see it," Robert stammered, the words sounding inadequate, clinical. "You see it? You're looking at him like he's a quarterly balance sheet, Robert, analyzing the assets, calculating the potential. You're not seeing your son. You're seeing an anomaly in your plans." The blood rushed to Robert's face. "That's not fair." Eliza's laugh was short and joyless. "Fair? You want to talk about what's fair? I was in labor for 36 hours, Robert. 36 hours. And you know where you were?" He knew. The memory, which he had suppressed so diligently, returned with the force of a runaway train, the presidential suite at the Four Seasons in Lisbon, the meeting to close the acquisition of the Lusitano Group, a deal that would put him at the top of the European market. He received the hospital call at 2 a.m, local time. He silenced the phone, telling himself that labor could take days, that he would catch the next flight. But then came the emergency call from a partner, a problem with the clauses, a threat of cancellation. "Lisbon," he whispered, the word coming out as a confession. "Lisbon," she confirmed, her voice cutting. "Closing a deal that your team of 20 people could have finalized, while your son was being born, while I was alone, scared, and with a hemorrhage that frightened the doctors." Timmy stirred, sensing the anguish in his mother's voice, and let out a small sigh. Eliza immediately softened, maternal instinct overriding her anger. She kissed the top of his head, murmuring words of comfort that Robert couldn't hear. The tenderness of that gesture, an act of love so pure and unconscious, broke something inside him. It wasn't done to provoke him. On the contrary, it was proof that he was no longer part of that equation. She was a complete universe for that boy, because he, the father, had chosen to be a black hole. "I didn't know about the complications," he said, his voice low. "You would have known if you had answered one of the 27 calls, or returned one of the messages, or gone to a single appointment in 9 months. Her voice remained steady, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands. "I sent you the ultrasound pictures, Robert. I sent you a video when he started kicking. I called crying when the doctor said he was breech, and that we might need an emergency C-section." Each sentence was a new stab. He remembered the notifications, the attachments he saw on his phone screen, and dismissed with a swipe, thinking, "I'll look at it later." The later that never came. "The night he was born," she continued, "until the last minute, I thought you would walk through that hospital door. Even after everything, a stupid part of me believed that when it truly mattered, you would show up." Robert wanted to defend himself, wanted to talk about the pressure, the deadlines, the responsibility he felt for his thousands of employees. But standing in that hallway, looking at the son he had never held, and the woman whose strength he had so underestimated, all his excuses sounded like dust. "I was building a future for us," he said, the words hollow even to his own ears. "No," Eliza corrected with devastating simplicity. "You were building an empire for you. We were just an item on your waiting list, patiently waiting for a slot in your schedule." A court security guard walked past them, his radio crackling with indecipherable codes, and the sound seemed to bring them back to reality. Eliza looked at Timmy, who had fallen asleep on her shoulder, his small fist still clenched in her sweater. When she raised her eyes to Robert again, something had changed. Anger had given way to a deep weariness. "I'm not trying to punish you, Robert. I'm just tired of being invisible." The phrase hit him with the force of a revelation, because it was true. Somewhere along the way, he had made the two most important people in his life disappear, not out of malice, but by the much more subtle and cruel crime of indifference. And now, with the divorce papers waiting for a signature, he realized he was minutes away from making their invisibility permanent and legal. The request for 30 days. The judge, Judge Matthews, cleared his throat, ready to resume the proceedings. "Well, I hope the recess was productive. If the parties are ready, we can proceed with the terms of dissolution." "Your Honor," Robert interrupted him, his voice surprisingly firm. Everyone in the room turned to him. "I would like to make a request." Robert's word, "Your Honor," cut through the stale air of the courtroom with the precision of a scalpel. Judge Matthews, who was already adjusting his glasses to read the final terms of the agreement, paused and raised an eyebrow. Mr. Carter, Robert's lawyer, stiffened in his chair, a clear sign that this was not part of the meticulously planned script. On the other side, Eliza, who was rocking a now awake and whimpering Timmy, looked up, an expression of caution and exhaustion on her face. She had heard Robert use that same tone to dominate boardrooms and turn around losing negotiations. It was the voice of the man who would not take no for an answer. "Proceed, Mr. Miller," the judge said, the neutral tone barely concealing a new spark of interest. Robert stood up, not with the arrogance of someone used to commanding, but with the hesitation of someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground. His eyes were not on the judge, but fixed on Eliza and the small being in her arms, who was now staring at him with those same gray eyes, curious and non-judgmental. "Your Honor, I request a postponement." A murmur rippled through the small group. Carter leaned in to whisper something, but Robert ignored him. "A postponement?" the judge questioned. "On what basis? The terms have already been agreed upon by both parties." "On the basis that I've been a complete idiot," Robert said, his voice low but audible to everyone. The raw honesty of the phrase shocked the room. "And on the basis that I just met my son 27 minutes ago." He looked at his watch, the same one that had previously marked his efficiency, now marking the beginning of his conscience. "I've spent the last 5 months treating his existence as a secondary item in my life. I cannot sign a document that makes that absence permanent without first trying to understand what I've missed, trying to prove, perhaps to myself more than anyone else, that I can be more than the man I've been up until today." He turned to Eliza, and for the first time there was no strategy in his gaze, only a naked appeal. "I ask for 30 days, 1 month, before any final decision on custody, visitation, or the end of our marriage. 1 month to learn." The silence that followed was profound. Eliza stared at him, her face an indecipherable mask. She had heard promises before. "I'll slow down. This is the last big project. After this, we'll have more time." All had proven hollow. Why would this be different? Judge Matthews, a man who saw the worst of human drama daily, watched the exchange with a weary wisdom. He addressed Eliza. "Ms. Hayes, the decision to accept this request is yours. The process can continue as planned, if you so wish." The weight of the world seemed to settle on Eliza's shoulders. She looked at Timmy, who, oblivious to the tension, stretched out a small hand towards Robert, an instinctive gesture, perhaps just a reflex, but one that seemed to carry immense meaning in that moment. She sighed, a sound that contained months of loneliness and a spark of hope she hated to feel. 30 days, she said, her voice little more than a firm whisper. "But let it be clear, Robert, this is not a game. It's not a negotiation, and there will be no extension. It's 30 days for you to show up, for real. If at any point I feel that this is just another one of your strategies to win, I will call my lawyer, and we will end this immediately." "Understood," Robert said, feeling a relief so overwhelming that his legs felt weak. He hadn't won. He had merely earned a chance not to lose everything forever. The new bottom line, the next day, Robert didn't go to the Miller Construction skyscraper on Wall Street. Instead, his black armored Audi pulled up in front of a children's store on the Upper East Side, an oasis of pastel colors and soft objects among the designer boutiques. He entered the store at 10 in the morning, dressed in a suit that cost more than the inventory on many of the shelves, feeling more out of place than in any meeting with foreign investors. A smiling saleswoman approached him. "Can I help you, sir? Looking for a gift?" "I need everything," Robert said, the phrase coming out awkwardly. "For a boy, 5 months." The saleswoman blinked in confusion. "Everything, sir? Like a complete layette?" "Everything as in?" "Nothing. I have nothing." He felt the need to explain, the shame burning on his face. "I'm the father, and I've been absent. I need to start from scratch." The saleswoman's expression changed from professional to understanding. She was an older woman, with kind eyes that seemed to say he wasn't the first, nor would he be the last lost father to cross that door. For the next 2 hours, Robert was guided through an unknown universe of anti-colic bottles, orthopedic pacifiers, different-sized diapers, rash creams, musical mobiles, and cribs that converted into beds. He, who negotiated billion-dollar contracts with a cold analysis of data, now listened attentively about the importance of a correctly dense mattress and the difference between a Pima cotton onesie and an Egyptian cotton one. He bought it all, not with the joy of a father preparing the nest, but with the desperation of a man trying to fill a 5-month void with objects. The trunk of his car was overflowing with boxes and bags, a material attempt to compensate for his emotional failure. The real test, however, came 3 days later. Eliza sent a short message. "Timmy has a routine checkup with the pediatrician tomorrow. Dr. Arthur in Soho. 3:00 p.m. If you want to come." The "if you want to" was a double-edged sword, an invitation and a test. Robert replied immediately. "I'll be there." Yeah. He arrived at the pediatric clinic 20 minutes early, his heart beating faster than before any board presentation. The waiting room, with its colorful walls and scattered toys, smelled of alcohol and a faint sweetness of milk. When Eliza entered, carrying Timmy in a carrier, Robert's world focused on them. He stood up, not knowing what to do. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she replied, without smiling, but without the hostility of the courthouse. In Dr. Arthur's office, a middle-aged man with a contagious calm, Robert sat in a chair in the corner, feeling like an intruder. The doctor, aware of the situation from Eliza, conducted the consultation with a naturalness that included Robert at every step. "Dad, can you hold him here while I examine him?" he asked. Robert took his son into his arms for the first time. The weight was surprising, solid and warm. The smell of baby, a mix of milk and powder, intoxicated him. Timmy stared at him with his big gray eyes, and Robert felt a lump in his throat. As Dr. Arthur talked about growth charts, solid food introduction, and the next developmental leaps, Robert realized the crushing truth. Being a father wasn't about providing. It was about being present. It was knowing that his son hated the taste of banana but loved pear. It was knowing that he slept better with the sound of white noise. It was knowing the small things that made up the big thing that was his son's life. Details that Eliza mastered and that were a foreign language to him. The most important thing at this stage for his emotional development, Dr. Arthur said at the end, looking directly at Robert, is predictability. It's for him to know he can count on the people who love him. Presence is worth more than any expensive gift. The phrase echoed in his mind until the following Saturday, the day Eliza reluctantly agreed to let him spend a few hours alone with Timmy. She arrived at his gigantic, impersonal condo on the Upper East Side, a place decorated by a famous designer, but lacking a soul. She handed him the baby and a bag that seemed large enough for an Arctic expedition. "The bottles are in the fridge. Just warm them in a double boiler. He usually naps around noon. If he cries a lot, it might be colic, and if you panic, I'll call you," Robert finished. "No," she said, surprising him. "Just hold him tight. Sing to him. Your voice is similar to mine. He'll recognize it. Sometimes, all they need is to know they're not alone." And then she was gone. The silence that settled in the apartment was the loudest Robert had ever heard. He and his son stared at each other. Timmy, sitting on a colorful activity mat Robert had bought, looked at him with solemn curiosity. Robert, sitting on the cold marble floor, felt like an imposter. "So," he began, feeling foolish for talking to a baby. "What do we do now?" As if understanding, Timmy stretched out his little arms and made a gurgling sound. Robert, not knowing what else to do, picked up a colorful rattle and shook it. Timmy laughed, a genuine laugh, a bell-like sound that filled the sterile apartment with more life than any party he had ever thrown there. Robert laughed too, surprised. He shook the rattle again, and again. For 20 minutes, the only thing that mattered in the world was the sound of that rattle and his son's laugh. Bottle time was a comical disaster. He overheated it. Then he cooled it too much. He spilled water on the floor. But when he finally got the temperature right and sat in the uncomfortable designer armchair with Timmy in his arms, something magical happened. The baby held the bottle with his tiny hands and sucked intently, his eyes fixed on Robert's. In that moment, there was no empire, no business, no divorce. There was only him and his son, connected by the simplest, most fundamental act of nourishment. Timmy fell asleep in his arms, his small, warm body completely relaxed against his chest. Robert remained motionless, afraid of breaking the spell. He looked at his son's serene face, the long eyelashes on the rosy cheek, and felt a wave of love so fierce and overwhelming that it left him breathless. It wasn't the calculated love he thought he would feel. It was a visceral, protective love, a love that redefined all his priorities in a single, silent instant. He, Robert Miller, the man who moved markets, was completely and irrevocably surrendered to a 15-pound being, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly rich. The following 3 weeks unfolded like a slow-motion movie for Robert. The days were divided into two parallel realities that clashed with increasing violence. In the morning, he was Mamidler, the real estate titan, chairing meetings, analyzing financial projections, and making decisions that affected the New York skyline. But in the afternoons, and in every moment he could steal, he was just Robert, the apprentice father. He learned to decipher Timmy's different cries, the high-pitched one for hunger, the irritated one for sleep, the plaintive one for a dirty diaper. He discovered that the boy loved the sound of bossa nova, especially the soft voice of João Gilberto, which calmed him almost instantly. He learned the art of bathing a slippery baby, an operation that required more concentration and dexterity than negotiating a complex contractual clause. Eliza observed everything with a cautious distance. She offered no compliments, but she also didn't criticize. She simply complied with the agreement, allowing Robert to slowly enter the routine she had built alone. With each visit, she noticed small changes. Robert's apartment, once a cold showroom, now had a corner with a colorful activity mat and a toy basket. A picture of Timmy, which she had sent, was on his bedside table, in the place where an Entrepreneur of the Year award used to sit. They were crumbs, she knew. but they were crumbs from a man who had never before allowed anything but work to invade his sacred space. He was trying. The question that haunted her was, for how long? Robert's life was made up of crises and unmissable opportunities. It was only a matter of time before one of them arose and put that new, fragile dedication to the test. The test arrived on a rainy Tuesday in the form of a call from New York. It was Mark O'Donnell, the CEO of one of the world's largest investment funds, a man Robert had been courting for almost a year for a monumental project. A mixed-use complex that would redesign an entire area of Queens, a deal valued at over $1 billion. "Robert, my friend," O'Donnell's voice sounded expansive over the car's speakerphone. Robert was on his way to Eliza's apartment to pick up Timmy for their day. "I've got good news. The board gave us the green light. They're excited, but they want to see you. They want to hear the passion for the project from the horse's mouth, as we say over here. Final meeting on Thursday at our Manhattan office. If we close, we sign on Friday. The fund's jet is at your disposal." The old Robert would have felt a rush of pure adrenaline. He would have said, "I'll be there," before O'Donnell even finished the sentence. He would have called his assistant, told her to pack his bags, cancel all other commitments. The victory was within his grasp, the biggest of his career. But the new Robert, the man who had spent the previous afternoon on the floor making faces to elicit a laugh from his son, felt something different. A knot in his stomach. Thursday. It was his day with Timmy. They had plans. Plans that, to the rest of the world, were insignificant. Going to the New York aquarium. Eliza had mentioned that Timmy was mesmerized by the colors and movements of the fish in a video. Robert wanted to see his son's eyes light up in front of a real tank. "Mark, that's fantastic," Robert said, his voice carefully neutral, as the gray landscape of the city passed by the window. "But Thursday is impossible for me." There was a silence on the other end of the line, so profound that Robert could hear the hum of his car's air conditioning. "Impossible," O'Donnell repeated, the incredulity clear in his voice. "Robert, we're talking about the Horizon Project, the biggest deal of your life. What could possibly be more important? What could possibly be more important?" The question echoed in Robert's mind. A year ago, the answer would have been nothing. 6 weeks ago, the answer would have been nothing. But now, the image that came to his mind was not of a signed contract or a victorious handshake. It was the image of Timmy, all 5 months of him, discovering the world. It was the silent promise he had made to himself not to miss any more of those moments of discovery. "I have an unmissable commitment on Thursday, Mark," Robert said, the decision solidifying in his voice. "A personal commitment." "Personal? Cancel it," O'Donnell said, with the naturalness of a man who believed everything had a price or could be rescheduled. "Robert, the board will only be meeting on Thursday. It's now or maybe never. They might cool off. Look for other partners." The veiled threat hung in the air. The old Robert would have given in. He would have rationalized that he could make it up to Timmy later, that the deal would secure his son's future for generations. But he was beginning to understand that the future Timmy needed was not financial. It was a future with a father who kept his promises, even the small ones, especially the small ones. "Then maybe it's never, Mark," Robert said. And the words surprised him as much as they must have surprised O'Donnell. "I can send my chief operating officer, Ricardo. He knows the project as well as I do, and is a brilliant negotiator. I will join by video conference for the initial presentation, but I can't be there personally. That is my final word." He was risking everything: his reputation, the deal, his credibility. He was breaking rule number 1 of his own success manual. Never, ever show an opponent that something is more important to you then closing the deal. O'Donnell's goodbye was cold and abrupt. Robert hung up the phone with trembling hands. He didn't feel victorious. He felt terrified. But beneath the terror was an undercurrent of something new: integrity. He had made a choice, not based on what was most profitable or strategic, but based on the man he wanted to become. When he told Eliza later that afternoon, while watching a fascinated Timmy stare at a tank of clownfish at the aquarium, he expected skepticism. He expected a, "We'll see if you don't change your mind." Instead, she just watched him for a long moment, her eyes searching for something deep in his. "O'Donnell called you?" she asked, remembering the name he had mentioned so often in the past. "Yes, he wasn't happy." "And you?" she asked, her voice soft. "Are you not regretful?" Robert looked at Timmy, who was hitting the glass with his little hand, babbling excitedly at the colorful fish. He looked at the sparkle in his son's eyes, a sparkle that no money in the world could buy. "No," he said. And the truth of that single word filled him with a peace he hadn't felt in years. "For the first time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Eliza didn't say anything. She just reached out and, for a brief moment, her fingers touched his over the stroller. It wasn't a gesture of reconciliation or forgiveness. It was simpler, and perhaps more significant. It was a gesture of recognition. She was seeing that perhaps, just perhaps, the change she had so desired and for which she had suffered so much was finally beginning to happen. He couldn't erase the mistakes of the past, but on that rainy New York day, in front of a fish tank, Robert Miller chose his present. And in doing so, he began to build a completely different future, the new empire. 2 years. In Robert's business world, 2 years was a complete cycle. The time for a project to go from paper to construction, rise against the sky, and be inaugurated with champagne and press coverage. But in the new economy of his life, the economy of the soul, 2 years was the time needed for the most complex and rewarding of all constructions, that of a family. The scene now was not a tense courthouse or a cold boardroom, but the green, inviting lawn of Central Park on a Sunday morning. The New York sun streamed through the trees, painting the ground with patches of light. Robert, now nearly 40, but with a lighter look than he had at 30, was running awkwardly, his linen shirt sleeves rolled up, trying to intercept a soccer ball kicked with more enthusiasm than aim by Timmy. At 2.5, Timmy was a dynamo of energy, a perfect mix of his father's determination and his mother's easy laugh. "Get it, Daddy, get it!" he shouted, his childish voice echoing through the park before tripping over his own feet and landing softly on the grass, bursting into contagious laughter. Robert threw himself down beside him, breathless, laughing too. The smell of the grass, the warmth of the sun, the sound of his son's laughter. This was his new definition of a successful business. From a nearby bench, under the shade of a flowering tree, Eliza watched the scene. She was no longer reading parenting manuals, but a novel by Lya Luft, something she hadn't done in years. A serene smile adorned her face. She and Robert hadn't remarried. The divorce papers still existed in some drawer, a reminder of how close they had come to an absolute end. But they had done something perhaps harder than marrying. They had chosen, day after day, to rebuild. The Miller Revolution, as the business press had dubbed Robert's turnaround, had worked. The construction company's productivity increased, employee turnover dropped drastically, and the company became a magnet for the best talents in the market, attracted by the promise of a work environment that respected life. The deal with O'Donnell, in New York, ended up being closed 6 months later, on even more favorable terms, as Robert's stance, instead of being seen as weakness, was interpreted as an unwavering strength. He had become a kind of corporate guru, invited to lecture on humanized leadership, invitations he almost always refused. His priority was different. "Hydration break, Timmy," Eliza called, opening a small thermal bag and pulling out a juice box for Timmy and a bottle of water for Robert. As Timmy drank his juice, sitting on Robert's lap, he pointed to the sky. "Daddy, the building you made?" He pointed to one of the Miller Construction skyscrapers that stood out on the New York skyline. Robert followed his son's finger. Years ago, he would have puffed out his chest with pride. He would have said, "Yes, son. Daddy built that." But his perspective had changed. "Yes, son, Daddy helped build that. But do you know what my favorite construction is?" Timmy looked at him with curiosity. "What?" "This one," Robert said, tickling his son's belly, which writhed in delightful laughter. "This mess of ours here on the grass, that's worth more than all the buildings in the world." They no longer lived in separate apartments. About a year ago, they bought a house in a leafy neighborhood with a backyard large enough for Timmy to run. It wasn't Robert's glass penthouse, nor Eliza's small, cozy apartment. It was a new space, neutral territory, where they could build new memories without the ghosts of the old ones. On weekends, the routine was sacred. Bike rides in the park, ice cream at the corner bakery, where the owner already knew Timmy by name. Sunday lunches at Eliza's mother's house, where Robert, the former absent billionaire, was now just the son-in-law who finally learned to be on time. "Do you know what I remembered today?" Eliza said later, as they walked hand in hand, with Timmy asleep in the stroller. "What?" Robert asked. "That court hearing, your face when you saw me walk in with him. You looked like you had seen a ghost." Robert smiled, a wistful smile. "It wasn't a ghost. It was my future that I was about to throw away. Sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night and think about what would have happened if you hadn't walked through that door, if the nanny hadn't had that emergency. I would have signed that paper, Eliza, and my life today would be empty, a heap of meaningless achievements. But I did walk in," she said, squeezing his hand, "and you asked for 30 days, and most importantly, you made every one of them count. Forgiveness didn't come with a grand gesture. It was woven into the everyday. In the nights, Robert got up to care for Timmy when he had a fever. In the mornings, he made coffee so Eliza could sleep a little longer. In the way he now listened, not just with his ears, but with his heart. He had learned that love was not a passive feeling, but an active verb, a daily choice. That night, after putting Timmy to bed, reading the story of a dragon who just wanted to make friends for the 10th time, Robert and Eliza sat on the porch of their new house. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant glow of the city. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, a question that had become a ritual between them. Robert looked up at the starry sky. "I was thinking about wealth. I spent my whole life measuring wealth in zeros, in my bank account, in the value of my stocks, in the height of my buildings. I was a billionaire, living in emotional poverty." He turned to her, his eyes shining with a sincerity that still disarmed her. "Today, I understand. True fortune is not what you accumulate. It's what you refuse to lose. It's the moments, your son's first step, his laugh when you make a funny face, the sound of his breathing, sleeping in the next room, the touch of the hand of the woman you love on yours. These moments, they are the only currency that really matters in the end." From inside the house came a low sound. Timmy, in his sleep, murmured a clear word. "Daddy." Robert closed his eyes, savoring the sound. It was not the applause of a board or the closing of a deal. It was the sound of an entire universe saying that he belonged right there. Robert Miller, the man who almost lost everything, had finally understood. He didn't need to build skyscrapers to touch the sky. He just needed to kneel on the floor to play with his son. And in that simple gesture, He found a wealth far beyond any measure. I hope this translation captured the heart of your story. Let me know if you have any other requests. Alternative open ending. The unsigned paper. Naquela noite, Roberto foi ao apartamento de Isadora. Bernardo já dormia. Eles se sentaram na pequena varanda do apartamento dela, com a vista para os telhados do bairro. Ele contou a ela sobre a reunião do conselho e o ultimato que dera. Ele estava mudando, e se a empresa não aceitasse, ele sairia. Isadora ouviu em silêncio, o rosto iluminado pela luz suave do abajur. Quando ele terminou, Conan disse de Vikonvik: "Không khen ngợi. Thay vào đó, cô chỉ nhìn anh một cách sâu sắc." O homem por quem me apaixonei, ela disse, a voz baixa, era um arquiteto sonhador que queria construir casas bonitas para as pessoas viverem. Em algum lugar ao longo do caminho, ele se perdeu e se tornou um empresário que só queria construir prédios mais altos que os dos outros. Ela fez uma pausa. Acho que aquele arquiteto talvez ainda esteja aí, debaixo de todos aqueles ternos caros. Naquele momento, sob o céu de São Paulo, Roberto não se sentia como um CEO que acabara de arriscar seu império. Ele se sentia como um homem que acabara de encontrar o caminho de volta para casa. The last day of the 30º dia chegou. O ar no escritório de Alan Carr, advogado de Robert, era tenso, muito mais do que no próprio fórum. Em cima da mesa de mogno lustrosa estavam eles, os papéis do divórcio. O documento, outrora o símbolo de um fim inevitável, agora parecia um artefato antigo. Robert entrou, não de terno, mas com uma camisa casual. Ele estava 15 minutos atrasado, algo inédito para ele. "Desculpe o atraso", disse ele a Alan Carter, seu advogado. "Bernardo teve que ter a mamadeira de manhã e... Bem, demorou mais do que o esperado." Ele sorriu, um sorriso genuíno que Carter nunca tinha visto. "Roberto", Carter começou, a voz grave. "O que você me disse sobre O'Donnell e o conselho é uma loucura, mas é um sinal. Isso mostra que você está comprometido, mas o prazo de 30 dias expirou. Hoje é o dia. Elisa e a advogada dela estão a caminho para finalizar os termos de custódia e pensão, ou assinar o divórcio se for o caso." A porta se abriu. Elisa entrou, mais elegante, e com uma expressão mais calma do que no dia do fórum. Ela estava sem time. "Ele está com minha mãe", ela explicou, a voz neutra. "Podemos começar. Não tenho muito tempo." A advogada de Eliza colocou uma pasta na mesa e Carter prontamente começou a revisar os termos, discutindo pensão, fundos fiduciários e a divisão de bens. Robert ouviu tudo com paciência. Ele era o homem mais rico na sala, mas sentia-se desinteressado pelo dinheiro. Quando a discussão técnica terminou, Carter pegou a caneta e a entregou a Robert. "Se você assinar aqui, Roberto, o divórcio estará finalizado. Os termos de custódia e visitação serão os que acordamos." Robert pegou a caneta, o peso familiar do metal em sua mão. Seu olhar, no entanto, não estava no papel. Estava em Eliza. "Eu entendi", disse Robert, sua voz baixa. "Eu entendi que a sua decisão não é sobre o dinheiro, Elisa. É sobre a confiança. Eu te pedi 30 dias e você me deu 30 dias. Eu fiz coisas diferentes. Eu me tornei um pai presente." Ele fez uma pausa, engolindo em seco. "Mas eu entendi que um mês de presença não apaga os meses de ausência e não conserta o que eu quebrei." Ele empurrou a caneta de volta para o advogado. "Eu não vou assinar isso." Todos na sala ficaram tensos. "O quê?" exclamou Carter. "Roberto, você está perdendo a chance de resolver isso de forma amigável." "Eu não vou assinar o divórcio", Robert repetiu. "Porque se eu assinar, eu resolvo a minha parte. Eu dou um fim legal para a minha falha como marido. E eu pego um cronograma de visitas para o meu filho." Ele olhou diretamente para Eliza, seus olhos cinzentos fixos nos dela. "Eu não quero um cronograma de visitas, Elisa. Eu quero uma vida com ele. Eu quero a chance de te reconquistar, de provar a você, dia após dia, não por 30 dias, mas pelo resto da nossa vida, que eu sou o homem que você escolheu. O silêncio era esmagador. Elisa estava atordoada. Era o movimento mais arriscado, mais não corporativo, mais humano que Robert Miller já havia feito. Eu não estou pedindo para você me perdoar agora, ele continuou. Eu estou pedindo para você não fechar a porta. Ele pegou a cópia do divórcio e rasgou-a, lentamente, em 2 metades. O som agudo do papel sendo rasgado quebrou a tensão. O divórcio acabou, ele disse olhando para os pedaços. Pelo menos o meu. Eu sou seu marido no papel, e eu serei um pai na vida. Você pode me expulsar da sua vida legalmente se quiser, mas eu não farei isso por você. Eu vou lutar por você e por nosso filho. E eu vou fazer isso sem contrato, sem prazo e sem a proteção de um advogado. Ele se levantou e olhou para ela uma última vez. Eu não vou assinar. O futuro do nosso casamento e o que vamos fazer a partir de amanhã é inteiramente com você, Eliza. Ele saiu da sala, deixando os pedaços de papel rasgado na mesa, deixando Elisa, sua má advogada, e seu próprio advogado em um estado de choque absoluto. Elisa olhou para os papéis rasgados. O divórcio não estava assinado. Ele não tinha nem se defendido, nem atacado. Ele havia se rendido, deixando o destino da família deles completamente nas mãos dela. That evening, Robert went to Eliza's apartment. Timmy was already asleep. They sat on her small balcony, overlooking the neighborhood rooftops. He told her about the board meeting and the ultimatum he had delivered. He was changing, and if the company wouldn't accept it, he would walk away. Eliza listened in silence, her face illuminated by the soft light of a lamp. When he finished, she said nothing about the business, no praise. Instead, she just looked at him with an intensity that laid him bare. The man I fell in love with, she said, her voice low, was a dreamer architect who wanted to build beautiful homes for people to live in. Somewhere along the way, he got lost and became a businessman who only wanted to build taller buildings than everyone else's. She paused. I think that architect might still be in there, under all those expensive suits. In that moment, under the New York sky, Robert didn't feel like a CEO who had just risked his empire. He felt like a man who had just found his way home. The last day of the 30th day arrived. The air in Mr. Alan Carter's, Robert's lawyer office, was more strained than it had been in the courtroom. On the polished mahogany desk lay a stack of papers, the divorce documents. The file, once the symbol of an inevitable end, now felt like an ancient artifact. Robert walked in, not in a suit, but a casual shirt. He was 15 minutes late, unprecedented for him. Sorry I'm late, he told Carter. Timmy had to have his morning bottle and, well, it took longer than expected. He smiled, a genuine smile Carter had never seen. Robert, Carter began, his voice grave. What you told me about O'Donnell and the board, it's madness, but it's a sign. It shows you're committed, but the 30-day deadline is up. Today is the day. Eliza and her attorney are on their way to finalize the custody and support terms, or sign the divorce, if necessary. The door opened. Eliza entered, looking more composed and calmer than she had on the courthouse day. She was without Timmy. He's with my mom, she explained, her voice neutral. We can start. I don't have much time. Eliza's attorney placed a folder on the table, and Carter promptly began reviewing the terms, discussing alimony, trust funds, and asset division. Robert listened with patience. He was the wealthiest man in the room, yet he felt detached from the money. When the technical discussion ended, Carter picked up the pen and handed it to Robert. If you sign here, Robert, the divorce is finalized. Custody and visitation terms will be as agreed. Robert took the pen, the familiar weight of the metal in his hand. His gaze, however, was not on the paper. It was on Eliza. I understand, Robert said, his voice low. I understand that your decision isn't about the money, Eliza. It's about trust. I asked you for 30 days, and you gave them to me. I did things differently. I became a father, a present father. He paused, swallowing hard. But I realized that 1 month of presence doesn't erase months of absence, and it doesn't fix what I broke. He pushed the pen back towards his lawyer. I won't sign it. Everyone in the room tensed up. What? Carter exclaimed. Robert, you're forfeiting the chance to resolve this amicably. I won't sign the divorce, Robert repeated. Because if I sign it, I resolve my part. I put a legal end to my failure as a husband, and I get a visitation schedule for my son. He looked directly at Eliza, his gray eyes fixed on hers. I don't want a visitation schedule, Eliza. I want a life with him. I want the chance to win you back, to prove to you, day after day, not for 30 days, but for the rest of our lives, that I am the man you chose. The silence was overwhelming. Eliza was stunned. It was the riskiest, most non-corporate, most human move Robert Miller had ever made. I'm not asking you to forgive me now, he continued. I'm asking you not to close the door. He picked up his copy of the divorce petition and tore it, slowly, into 2 halves. The sharp sound of the paper tearing broke the tension. The divorce is over, he said, looking at the pieces. At least mine is. I am your husband on paper, and I will be a father in life. You can legally kick me out of your life if you want, but I won't do it for you. I will fight for you and our son, and I will do it without a contract, without a deadline, and without the protection of an attorney. He stood up and looked at her one last time. I'm not signing. The future of our marriage and what we do starting tomorrow is entirely up to you, Eliza. He walked out of the room, leaving the torn pieces of paper on the table, leaving Eliza, her attorney, and his own attorney, in a state of absolute shock. Eliza looked at the torn papers. The divorce wasn't signed. He hadn't defended himself, nor attacked. He had surrendered, leaving the fate of their family entirely in her hands. She had the power to keep the door shut, or to open it again, perhaps forever. Will she keep the distance she fought so hard to gain? Or will she risk it all on the man she's seen begin to change? A change that could be real, or simply temporary? What do you think Eliza will do? The end. For now.